Hi, thanks for tuning in to episode number 61 of the Doctor Podcast show. And I'm your host, Dr. Robert Seichert. And if you like Doctor Podcasts, which about 1 million people have so far, I'd like you to click on the subscribe button and the follow button. And if you love this episode, which I'm sure you will, please also repost it and click on the like button. Today, we have a great and fascinating guest, Dr. Stephen Marcus. Dr. Marcus is a physician who is the CEO of Cantex Pharmaceuticals, which is a pharmaceutical company in Florida. And Dr. Marcus is involved in investigating a new drug that will be used for treating a variety of diseases and conditions. Unlike all my previous episodes where I've interviewed physicians who are basically taking care of patients in clinical medicine or surgery, Dr. Marcus chose many years ago to be involved in the pharmaceutical industry and in developing, innovating new drugs that are extremely helpful for the public and treat a variety of diseases and conditions. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Steve. I really appreciate the time you're taking. I know you're a very busy guy running a pharmaceutical company.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So tell us about your training after medical school, like internship, residency, fellowship. What did you do after medical school?
Sure. So graduated from New York Medical College and did my internship and residency at Lenox Hill Hospital in Midtown Manhattan. And along the way, I became interested in cancer and particularly developed an interest in malignant brain tumors. And I knew that the leading center in the United States at the time for treating and investigating malignant brain tumors was the University of California in San Francisco, known as UCSF. And so I was able to secure a fellowship at UCSF in medical oncology, and did that and continued to be interested not only in brain tumors, but in other forms of cancer as well. And after that, I practiced medical oncology for a few years and also moonlighted in emergency rooms. I was interested in being an ER doctor. I had moonlighted in ERs during my fellowship, and so I was part-time an ER doctor and part-time a medical oncologist. And then an opportunity in the pharmaceutical industry arose, and that was the last I saw patients. So it's been now about 39 years since I've actually had my hands on a physically hands on a patient.
So you went in several different directions until you found something that you really love to do. That's a little bit unusual for most physicians, as you know. What percentage of physicians do you think take the track that you did and actually work in the pharmaceutical industry and develop new and innovative drugs?
Well, it's far less than 1%, I'm sure. And also, I think it's becoming a little bit more popular now because now many physicians are interested in the possibility of moving away from clinical medicine into the pharmaceutical industry, and they join at different levels. Often they work for contract research organizations, it's nicknamed CROs, or they work for a large pharmaceutical company. So I think more physicians have become interested in it, but at the time that I entered the pharmaceutical industry, which was in early 1985, very few physicians had thought of this as a career path. And at the time, frankly, I wasn't thinking of it as a career path either. I was thinking of it that the company that I was recruited to was developing a drug that was of interest to me. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to do for a few years and see what happened.
Right. You never know where these things go. Some of them have been huge blockbusters and have helped millions and millions of people around the world. Now, you were also interested in multiple sclerosis and basically you were involved in the discovery of beta seron, which I believe is the first drug that was used to treat MS or multiple sclerosis. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. It came about in a very unusual way. The company hired me. The company was called Triton Biosciences, and Triton was a subsidiary of Shell Oil Company. And Shell, being the largest chemical company in the United States, in fact, probably the largest chemical company in the world, saw that interferons were the hot subject. And everybody wanted to be in the interferon game because they thought that interferons would cure cancer. And so there were people that had developed alpha interferon, several companies with that, and some companies developed gamma interferon, but nobody had successfully developed a beta interferon. And so they developed beta interferon and were interested in testing this as a treatment of malignant brain tumors. And so that was the reason that they hired me, and that was what drew me to that company, was the opportunity to lead a research program for glioblastoma, to be specific, a highly malignant form of brain cancer that begins in the brain. And so I was on a site visit to Thomas Jefferson Medical School and conducted a good discussion about glioblastoma. And on the way to the elevator, the investigator said to me, "By the way, have you ever thought about testing this drug in multiple sclerosis? I've done some work with alpha interferon in multiple sclerosis. I think it had some activity. The company has abandoned it, and you should have a look at this." And that's how it came about. And
Wow,
so,
just an elevator.
right. And so so I looked into it, and I thought there was something there.
Wow. So beta seron was the first drug used for treating MS?
Right, right. So at the time, there was no treatment for multiple sclerosis other than symptomatic treatment. Baclofen was a muscle relaxant that was used for multiple sclerosis, and many drugs had been tested and had failed. And when I looked at the information about the previous study with alpha interferon, the other form of interferon, I was able to see a fundamental flaw in the way that that drug was tested. And it was something that I saw as a medical oncologist, and that is that the studies that were done by the other companies were looking at the so-called maximum tolerated dose of the drug. And maximum tolerated by a cancer patient is very different than maximum tolerated by somebody with multiple sclerosis. And they gave too high a dose of the drug. And so I realized that giving a lower dose might be of the other drug may be effective. And so we gave a lower dose. We also, for the first time, demonstrated the utility of MRI scans, which really revolutionized the field. Also, instead of looking at progression as the so-called primary endpoint, as the metric for determining effectiveness, we looked at relapses, which were the primary endpoint. So it really revolutionized the way that MS was investigated. And it turned out that the drug hit on all the endpoints. The MRIs were strikingly different. There were much fewer exacerbations. And so FDA approved the drug. And the manufacturer had only manufactured enough drug to treat 25,000 patients, thinking that there wasn't that much more demand than that. And on day one, 67,000 people put their name in a lottery to get the drug. And I realized that what I had done touched 67,000 people. And from that point on, I said, this is where I'm going to spend my career.
Wow, that's an amazing story and a huge accomplishment. Congratulations on that. And then you've moved on, and now you're at Cantex Pharmaceuticals, which is based in Florida, right?
That's right.
How long have you been with Cantex?
I've been with this company for about 15 years. And so we originally were developing another drug, which we ultimately sold to another company. And then I was interested in a particular mechanism which involved RAGE, which is a synonym, which is an acronym for the receptor for advanced glycation end products. It's something that is on the surface of cancer cells and on the surface of immune cells that appears to drive a range of illnesses. And I became aware of a drug, which was an oral, that had been tested for Alzheimer's disease, which was very safe, but unfortunately didn't show effectiveness in Alzheimer's. But I was interested in its potential as a cancer treatment. And so I was able to acquire the rights to that drug from the previous company. And that's how I ended up with azaliragon, which is the name of the drug that I'm currently focused on.
Right. Another amazing story and accomplishment. Now, is Cantex a private company or a public company at this point?
It's privately held.
It's privately held at this point. Now, by the way, how's it in Florida today? I see that you have a major storm or hurricane there. Are you okay there?
Yeah, well, I'm lucky. I'm on the East Coast, and the East Coast was unaffected. It was
Really?
primarily it was probably the West Coast of Florida, Tampa, Naples, that area.
Oh,
So
I
I was
see.
lucky.
All right. Well, glad to hear that. Hopefully, people on the West Coast are doing okay. Now, tell us how your medical clinical experience, the years after you finished your training, influenced your leadership style, decision-making process, and helped you leverage that to drive innovation and growth at Cantex.
I think that my training was excellent, and also, I not to be pompous, but I felt I became a very good doctor, and I think that to develop drugs, uh, uh, you really need to be a good physician. You really need to understand clinical medicine, and you need to have a certain level of practicality when you're looking at how a study is done, the endpoints, what makes a study attractive, what makes a study something that can be enrolled. Also, one has to be convincing not only to the patients to be enrolled, but also to other physicians. They have to see that you know what you're doing. You have to inspire confidence in folks. And so I think being capable is important. And also, just as in any sphere of business activity, one has to have social intelligence also. One has to be able to get along with people. One has to be able to build teams and be competent.
Right. So basically, those are the strategies that you use to get top talent and be highly effective in the pharmaceutical industry. How
Yeah.
do you maintain all these different types of relationships with your stakeholders, with investors, with physicians, with patients? You have to keep a lot of people happy.
Well, you have to keep people informed, and I'm very vigilant about keeping my all the investigators and collaborators closely informed on what's going on. The same with investors to the extent that you can do that. There's a difference between being a private company and a publicly traded company. If you are a publicly traded company, you have to be very careful what you say to investors, because there's something called Reg FD, which means that you can't selectively disclose confidential information to an investor on the basis of which they invest. It's against the law. Whereas if you're a privately held company, then you have a little bit more flexibility with what you're able to tell investors. But whatever you tell investors has to be strictly the truth. But since somebody can't trade on that information if you're privately held, it's a different thing. But you can keep your investors closely informed, and of course everybody that you're collaborating with.
Right. Now, tell us about the drug that your company is developing again, and what conditions it can treat, and how many different clinical trials you have for this drug.
Yeah. Well, our focus has been on cancer indications, even though there are many, many indications for which this drug could be useful. So many that we just can't simply do it, and partly because everything costs money, and these clinical trials have become incredibly expensive to conduct. So we're currently in the clinic in two clinical trials in glioblastoma, and
Which is
the
the brain cancer.
which is the brain cancer. And so we have one trial in the US and one trial going on in Spain. And in fact, I couldn't help myself but have Lenox Hill Hospital as one of the sites on the brain tumor study. Lenox Hill actually now has a phenomenally good neurosurgical program. So we have 8 US centers, all top centers that are experienced with brain tumor clinical trials. And as well, we discovered a couple of interesting things. One is that as Aliragon, at least in animal studies, appears to reverse what some would call the immunosuppressive microenvironment of the tumor, which translated means that there's something about the inside of the tumor that repels the immune system. And in animal studies, our drug reverses that. And so that was a very interesting finding. Also, in animal studies, our drug appears to make radiation therapy more effective. Again, it's animal studies. And so the study we've got going in glioblastoma combines azaliragon with radiation therapy for people with newly diagnosed glioblastoma. And as well, there's also information that RAGE plays a role in resistance of other cancers to radiation. For example, brain metastasis also is often resistant to radiation. And we have a clinical trial of azaliragon in combination with radiation therapy for patients with brain metastasis. And we have also information that azaliragon enhances the effectiveness of radiation in pancreatic cancer. That's all mouse data, but we hope to translate that into humans. And we've got a trial in progress in metastatic pancreatic cancer. And finally, at Georgetown Medical School, the so-called Lombardi Cancer Institute, they developed data that azaliragon has an anti-metastatic effect in a type of breast cancer called triple-negative breast cancer, which is probably the most malignant form of breast cancer. And so they have a study in patients with newly diagnosed breast cancer in progress. And as well, azaliragon appears to have a neuroprotective effect. In other words, women receiving intensive chemotherapy for breast cancer commonly develop cognitive disturbances. They nickname it chemo brain. And so they're looking to see whether azaliragon can prevent chemo brain in women getting intensive chemotherapy of breast cancer. So that's another trial. And then finally, outside of cancer, there's evidence that RAGE drives multiple organ failure in people hospitalized with severe pneumonia or patients hospitalized with COVID. And so we have an investigator-initiated trial in Michigan and in Texas in people hospitalized with severe pneumonia to see if we could prevent kidney and lung failure. So those are just trials that are in progress, but there's a lot of other things we'd like to do, which we hope to do at some point, either alone or potentially with a pharmaceutical partner.
Right. It's amazing that one drug like that can have all those different attributes and treat a variety of different conditions, including cancer, infections, kidney disease. It's all with inhibiting that RAGE reaction that you mentioned.
That's right. In fact, in your line, Bob, there's evidence that RAGE is a driver of retinal diseases, proliferative vitreoretinopathy, and also diabetic retinopathy. RAGE has been implicated there as well.
Right.
It's just beyond our ability to really do studies in those indications. Also, RAGE has been heavily implicated in refractory asthma. And actually, one of the more interesting things is that RAGE is apparently a driver of obesity. And
Really?
the mechanism there is that we have white fat and brown fat, and the RAGE appears to be an ancient mechanism that we have to store white fat for in times of starvation, and so RAGE inhibits the conversion of white fat into brown fat, and blocking RAGE enhances that. And that was actually discovered at your institution at NYU by Anne-Marie Schmid, in case you may know her name possibly, but she's a well-known researcher. And so she's been advocating the use of RAGE inhibitors for potential treatment of obesity. So there's a lot that can be done with RAGE, but not to oversell it, but all these things are in the background. But as a small company, you have to focus on what is most likely to work and what is most likely to get you on base, showing that there's a significant disease for which there's a therapeutic effect. And that's why we're primarily focused on cancer, which is also the area in which I have the greatest amount of expertise.
Right. Sounds like you're sitting on the next Ozempic.
but possibly.
That would be awesome because it treats so many different conditions and diseases well. It could wind up being like Ozempic, which, every week they have a new finding that it helps certain things. So this could be a different category drug. Now, I don't think the public understands this, but can you explain the process that is required to get a drug approved by the FDA? Just briefly, the different clinical trials, how long that takes, how expensive that is, and the
Right.
process that the FDA makes you go through to
Sure.
get a drug approved.
Sure. So it all starts with creating a molecule and making sure that you manufacture that molecule according to what's called GMP, good manufacturing practices. And that is not a trivial matter for some of the more complicated molecules. And then once that's done, you have to do toxicology, looking for its safety in animal models. If it's for benign diseases, in other words, a disease that's not like cancer, they ask you to look at carcinogenicity. Does the drug cause cancer? And they want to see pharmacology. They want to see its effect on different organ systems. And usually they want to see that data in two forms of animals. And then once you have all of that data, then you're ready for a phase 1 clinical trial, phase 1 being safety. And so you enroll whatever number of patients are necessary to look at the safety and also to look at whether the drug is well absorbed and whether the blood levels that are achieved and any evidence of accumulation in different organs. And then following that, once safety is established, then you do a phase 2 clinical trial. And phase 2 is looking for preliminary evidence of a therapeutic effect. In other words, is there something that says that this drug could work? And so you would do a phase 2 trial in a setting where you think the drug would work and the drug could ultimately be approved. And following that, you do a phase 3 trial usually. And the phase 3 is a randomized trial in which patients receive drug or don't receive drug. Now, having said that, there are exceptions to the rule. And in fact, I was responsible for one of those exceptions. And that was I developed a drug called fludarabine. And there we did a trial in refractory chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And it only had one arm to the trial. Nobody got placebo. But there was unmistakable evidence of an effect in people with refractory disease. And so based on phase 2 only data, the drug was approved. And there are some other examples. There are some other examples of that. But when there's any question about it, then a randomized controlled trial is important. Now
So the vast majority of new drugs have to go through the phase 3.
yeah,
Right.
most do. And that doesn't necessarily mean placebo. It could mean that it's the standard treatment versus the standard treatment plus your drug. Because, for example, in my view, placebo-controlled trials in cancer patients are almost always inappropriate.
Right.
So it could be, but everybody has to get the best available treatment, and it could be best available plus or minus the new drug.
Right. So you compare it to the current standard treatment and see if your results are better in the patients that got the drug.
Right.
So tell us approximately how long that process takes from discovering the molecule, doing the toxicology, and going through the 3 different phases. I know it's different for different drugs, but on the average, how long a process is that?
It could take 10 years or more.
10
Uh,
years.
and it depends on the disease also. So, for example, for some illnesses, it may take a long time to enroll the patients, and then you have to follow them for a period of time. So, for example, the phase 3 trials in multiple sclerosis, we had to follow the patients for 2 years, but also it took a year and a half, it takes a year to 2 years sometimes to enroll all the patients necessary for the trial. So even just the phase 3 trial can take 3 to 4 years, depending on the indication. Or if it's for a cancer and the cancer is a particularly aggressive one, perhaps the clinical trial can be shorter.
Right. So it depends on the condition or disease you're treating and the drug. So, what's the quickest that it can be approved? 10 years is sort of the max. How quickly can some other drugs be approved?
Well, if it's for cancer, they can be approved more quickly. The key
Mm.
is to enroll the patients rapidly, to find the centers that can enroll the patients rapidly, and then to decide on what are the endpoints that the FDA will accept as a basis for approval. And even that is undergoing some change. In the past, for example, FDA has liked to see survival as the endpoint, and and for survival can take a while because sometimes survival can be prolonged, and sometimes the evidence of an effect is unambiguous earlier in terms of that the tumor shrinks or that there's a delay in the tumor progression, and so it can depend on the cancer. But
Right,
critically important, though, is finding the right centers to enroll the patients quickly.
right. And you're involved in that process with the people that work at Cantex?
Yes, yeah, and so I know some of the centers, and of course there are challenges to doing that, and I think part of the challenge for a patient is doing their homework and finding the centers that have the most innovative treatment. So, in most cities or many cities, like for example, New York, you have maybe five or more centers, where actually probably a lot more than five centers to which somebody could go, and they don't always refer patients to a center of excellence. So if you choose the wrong one of the 5 or 10 centers that are treating the disease, you could have a delayed enrollment. So you have to find which are the centers that are considered to have the highest population, but also the patient has to do their homework and which is not easy to do, but also
Right.
look at sites like clinicaltrials.gov or speak to their treating physician to find, which are the centers that are doing the most innovative research, if innovation is the appropriate path to go.
Right. So if a patient has a disease or a condition, they can go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in their disease or cancer in the search field, and that'll come up with the various centers that have clinical trials going on.
And in their area. So you could plug in, the name of the disease, and then you could plug in what stage of the trial. So phase 1, phase 2, or trial. You could plug in your geographic area if travel is going to be a challenge, and the local clinical trials will pop up.
That's a great way to find out because patients can't search by drug name because they're not familiar with the drug name.
Right.
So tell us approximately how expensive this is, this process that could take 4 or 5 up to 10 years to get a drug approved. I know it varies from disease and drug, but on the average, what does that cost?
It's very expensive, and the clinical trials require you to follow what's called GCP, which is an acronym for Good Clinical Practices. And so we're heavily regulated as is appropriate,
Right.
and we have to follow these regulations. And generally speaking, small companies such as mine can't really hire sufficient staff to manage the trial. You have to work with contract research organizations, and they are expensive. And so a clinical trial involving only 30 patients can cost $4 or $5 million to conduct, even though it's astonishing how expensive these trials are. But that's how much they cost. And so there are many um, websites that have said the cost of developing new drug is $1 billion, and probably not. It depends on the nature of the drug and the type of clinical trial. My own experience is significantly less than that, but even so, it's hundreds of millions. It can be hundreds of millions of dollars, and so
Right.
that's the challenge in raising cash. So I think cancer is somewhat less expensive because it requires a smaller number of patients, and you follow the patients for a somewhat shorter period of time. But it's tens of millions of dollars, and or upwards of $100 to $200 million. Whereas developing a drug for a benign indication like obesity would cost a lot more.
So the more relatively benign the condition, the more the FDA wants to be like close to 100% sure that there's not some problems with the drug that might cause toxicity or other problems.
That's right.
I see. And for diseases like cancer, like glioblastoma, which has almost 100% mortality, or pancreatic cancer, they'd be a little more lenient.
That's right. That's right. No, they still will make sure that there's the appropriate safety parameters, but most drugs that treat cancer patients do have a range of toxicities. The key is it can't be too toxic. The treatment can't be worse than the disease.
Right, right. So how do you convince investors to give you tens of millions of dollars for a period of several years and keep them convinced that this is the right path without revealing any secrets, of course? How's that done?
Frankly, it's a challenge because investors have the option of investing in life sciences or investing in Bitcoin or
Right,
financial technologies or anything else, Amazon. So the difference between investing in a small company like ours and investing in some of the other companies is the potential to make a major profit with a pharmaceutical company. But the problem with a small pharmaceutical company from the investor point of view is that it's binary. Either you do very well or you lose everything. And
right,
because if the drug doesn't work, the company and the product has no value. And
right.
so you have to convince the investors that the drug makes sense. The investors also will look to make sure that the management knows what it's doing, that the management has a track record of having successfully developed drugs in the past.
That's where
And
you come in.
yeah, yeah, and I've been fortunate that again, to be candid, the drugs I've developed have been administered to literally hundreds of thousands of people and generated, from the investor point of view, a lot of revenue. So investors will also look at that. And then, of course, they will look at, have you got any evidence that this has an effect in humans? Have you got any data yet? And so the challenge for the industry in general, and even for my company, is that there's an area which folks sometimes call the valley of death. And the valley of death is between when you have preclinical data and when you have clinical data. And so companies have a great deal of difficulty traversing the valley of death, getting to where investors will say, well, I can take on faith, given all I've seen and with my knowledge and instinct, that this preclinical data will translate into clinical efficacy. And so that's the biggest challenge with small companies have is getting from preclinical to clinical and getting that stage funded.
Valley of death, huh?
Yeah, that is the term of art that's used in the industry.
It's interesting. Well, today, since Wall Street and the stock market was the valley of death, you might get a lot of calls from investors now who might think that investing in your company is more profitable and less risky. We'll see how that goes. Now, the investors that you get, are they mostly just people who have lots of money and diversify, or are these people who are knowledgeable in healthcare and biology and biotech and things like that, or is it variable?
It's somewhat variable, but it's primarily life science investors. So, and life science is a broad category. It can include medical devices, it can include pharmaceuticals, it can include agricultural items, and so anything that deals with a living organism. But primarily they are biotech and pharmaceutical investors. They are often venture capital firms which tend to invest in earlier stage companies. Some of them are what are called family offices, which are very wealthy people who are investing across many industries and have an interest in the life sciences. And they often have money managers managing their money. and there are just some individual, but what are nicknamed high net worth individuals who will invest in the industry. So it's kind of a basket of different types of investors. It's usually not a mom and pop investor. It's usually not somebody who's putting in a few $1,000s into a company. These are usually people who are putting a very significant amount of money into the company, given the major cost of development.
Right. Now, at what point can you get an investor or a partner, like a major pharmaceutical company, like let's say Pfizer or Lilly or Regeneron, to invest in your company and speed up the process of approval? Does that happen in phase one, phase two, phase three? And how do you do that?
It can happen at any stage, depending on how compelling your story is and the interest and the needs of the pharmaceutical company. Just as an example, another drug I developed is called Mavenclad, and that is a second drug for multiple sclerosis. It's an oral treatment of MS that is really quite effective. And I had licensed the rights to that from Scripps for the Institute in San Diego. And because I had developed the previous MS drug, one of the researchers that I knew, who I worked with, had gone into the industry and worked for Serono. And so I called him up and said, hey, I've got this drug which looks really good, and how'd you like to collaborate on this? And that led to a collaboration with Serono. They licensed the product. We had a joint development team and successfully developed that into what is now a very successful drug. But we had a fair amount of data, phase 2 data at the time, and unique formulation, and so so some of it is also personal connections, knowing somebody in the other
Right,
company, and there the personal connection really made the difference.
right. Now, as you know, there's been some criticism in recent years that all these new drugs, which work well and have been major breakthroughs in treating some conditions that were previously not treatable, are very expensive. Some of them cost tens of thousands a year, or sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for treatment. And the public is annoyed by that and tends to badmouth some pharmaceutical companies. And the government's also been uh, basically commenting on that in a negative way and criticizing some companies. And the insurance companies don't want to pay for these super expensive drugs. What's the solution for that? I know it takes you many years and millions of dollars to get this approved, but if your drug is approved and it costs $200,000 a year, how's the average person going to afford that?
Yeah, it's a real problem, and I think I take a somewhat different view of many of my colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry. I think charging $200,000-$300,000 for treatment is a lot, and so companies have to recoup the cost of their investment, and also as far as my ability to get investors interested in the product, they have to ultimately see there's a profit at the other end.
Right.
And if they don't think that there's a profit, then they're simply not going to invest, and drugs won't be developed. One of the big items which I think is driving the cost of some of the treatments is that they're very complicated to manufacture. Recombinant proteins, some of these exotic cell-based therapies, which are wonderful because they have saved many lives, but at the same time, they're very complicated to manufacture, and that costs money. That requires a large team of people to do that.
Right.
When
I recently interviewed a physician who's been involved in the CAR T lymphocyte and CAR T cell treatments, which are super expensive.
Yeah, and from my point of view, I think they're wonderful, and I think it saves lives. But from the standpoint of global oncology, they're impractical because you can't do CAR T therapy, or at least as I can't foresee CAR T therapies costing $200,000-$300,000 per patient for most cancers. The system just can't afford that.
Right.
And so part of my own strategy moving forward was to look for small molecules being things that are organic chemicals that are relatively easy to manufacture. And that is azaliragon. Azaliragon is a pill, and it is extremely well tolerated. And so firstly, the cost of manufacturing is lower. The cost of administration, well, patients popping it by mouth, so it's easy. It's
Right. It
stable.
doesn't have to be infused as an IV or an injection, so the patient can do it at home.
Right. And it can be distributed out of your local CVS pharmacy because it's stable at room temperature. So all of these things will drive down the cost so that ultimately the product from an investor point of view will be highly profitable. But at the same time, it'll also be much more affordable to the patient because all of those ancillary costs won't be built in. You won't have to pay for the exorbitant markups because of the manufacturing or the distribution or hospital infusions. Also, it doesn't require blood tests because it's just well tolerated. So all the hematology and blood chemistry tests, they don't have to be done. Patients don't have to be hospitalized. They don't require things to make sure they don't have an anaphylactic reaction from an infusion. So all of this will drive down the cost if the drug works, if the drug proves to be
Right.
effective.
Sounds even better than Ozempic, which has to be injected, right?
Right.
So that's good. If the pill works, that's awesome. Now, you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the program that more and more physicians are working with pharmaceutical companies rather than going into clinical medicine. Why do you think that's happening?
Uh, I think that, here I have to rely on what I read in the papers. And
Right,
what I see are that there's a fair amount of burnout
right,
in physicians. And there are a lot of stressors that affect physicians' day-to-day life, not only, especially oncologists, but people in all specialties where just the challenges treating patients, the emotional challenges of treating patients, and as well the finances that are associated with it, the lack of proper reimbursement in some instances, all the paperwork and getting prior authorizations and things, which frankly I'm not as familiar with that because I've not had to do that, but I've certainly read about it in the journals, and I think there's a lot of physician burnout and people looking for alternative careers. And so there are quite a number of physicians now that are exploring the possibility of entering into the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, you're right. Burnout is a big problem. I know a lot of my colleagues who practice medicine feel somewhat burned out. It's become very difficult. Part of the problem is the EMR, or electronic medical records computer systems, are just very time consuming. That's a separate issue.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that you licensed your drug from another company, I believe it was initially. Is that right?
That's right. So
Yeah.
we licensed it from a company called VTV Therapeutics, a company in North Carolina.
Right. And how did you discover that? I mean, there must be hundreds or thousands of molecules out there that have potential use like this. How do you figure out which one to license and how do you find out about
Yeah. Well, first, my general strategy in my career has been to repurpose drugs developed for one indication where I thought there was a flaw in their development, or where maybe the development was perfect, but the wrong disease was chosen, and where it could be repurposed for another indication. And so everything that I've developed in the past has been along those lines. And then I was interested in this particular mechanism of rage. I'd become aware of that because of the previous drug I was developing, which was an intravenous drug. It was a derivative of heparin, and heparin does also have an impact on rage, but giving heparin is less practical because it requires an intravenous infusion. And so And also,
Heparin's a blood thinner for the public out there.
that's right. And so the drug I was developing previously was a form of heparin, which actually did not thin the blood. And so it was a so-called low anticoagulant heparin derivative, where we'd engineered the molecule so that it didn't anticoagulate. And it was a rage, it had an impact on rage, but from a practical point of view, it seemed to me that a pill would be the way to go. Also,
Right.
for treating things like brain tumors, I was also looking for a RAGE inhibitor that would get into the brain, get across something called the blood-brain barrier. And so I, looking around, I saw that there was this company in North Carolina that had something that looked perfect. And they were doing their trial in Alzheimer's, and just knowing that so many things have failed for Alzheimer's, I was watching them carefully. And when I saw their press release indicating that they were going to abandon the product because it failed its phase 3 clinical trial, I rang them up and said, hey, I think I can do something with your drug. And one thing led to another, and we made a deal.
That's fascinating. But once you tell them that you're interested in licensing their drug, they probably ask you for what purpose, and why don't they then do it themselves instead of giving it to you?
Because they didn't have the expertise to do it. And so, they didn't really know about cancer. And also, once a company has a drug that has failed for an indication, they often get very pessimistic about it. Their board says, just give it to somebody else just to make sure that we have some return on this in the end if the drug works. And so,
And they basically run out of money and investors also because it failed, right? So nobody wants to spend more money on a new trial.
right, right. So they didn't have the expertise to develop this for cancer, and I made a compelling case that I knew what I was doing, and we made a deal.
Wow. That's awesome. So you have to do lots and lots of research to find these molecules that potentially can be repurposed to treat another condition.
Well, you have to look around, and also, Googling, and also getting on to PubMed. It's remarkable what you could find. Uh, but you only have a few shots to take, so you have to make sure that you take a good shot. But it also speaks to the other skill set that you need in the industry, depending on what level you are, which is the ability to negotiate agreements, and also an understanding of patent law. Because in the end, if there's no patent, there's no drug. Because
Right.
there's a lot of interest in repurposing old drugs. Like, for example, I took a shot at repurposing disulfiram, which is an antabuse, which has some potential anti-cancer effects, and I created a new formulation of disulfiram. But in the end, there was no patent on the molecule, and so I saw that if there's no patent, there's no way of funding the research. So much of what you see about companies repurposing old drugs for which there's no patent, those almost always go nowhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How long is your patent good for?
We have what's called a composition of matter patent, which is really the gold standard. It means on the molecule itself, and
Okay.
and that patent expires in 2039.
Oh,
So,
so you
we've
got
got
a good couple of years there.
yeah, so we've got a good 15 years of patent life, which is actually unusual for a drug at the stage of development that we're in, with so much preclinical and clinical data and advancing clinical trials. So we've got a very nice long patent life.
Right. That's fantastic. So I think this could be a multi-billion-dollar drug, like Ozempic, I said. And after the people at Pfizer and Lilly watch this interview, they'll be calling you.
Perhaps,
Hopefully so.
for me, I always am focused though on treating the patients, on developing drugs
Right.
to help people. The finances follow at some point, but my goal is to just have the pride of having developed something that helped a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing like that. There's no better satisfaction than that. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time from your busy day and schedule to talk with us today. This has been very informative and educational for me, and I'm sure it'll be even more informative for the public so they have an understanding of how complicated and difficult and expensive it is to get these drugs approved. So I want to thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks, Bob.